All right, welcome to another episode of Litigious, a podcast about all things lawsuits and legal stories in the news. I'm Scott Peterson. Giovanna is with me. Reminder, this podcast is brought to you by Durazio Peterson, an employment and personal injury law firm in New York. Any questions, reach out to us on social media, at all the socials, particularly Instagram. If you have questions that you'd like answered in the podcast, hit us up on Instagram. It's the best way to do it. Reminder, if you like the show, please follow us, give us a 5-star review, and share with a friend. That's the best way to get the word out with all this good content that we're producing here. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Before we get into kind of the meat of the episode, a quick update on the Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni trial, or excuse me, lawsuit, and a recent order relating to some what I would imagine are very private text messages between Blake Lively and Taylor Swift. What happened?
Right. So the big news last time was that Justin Baldoni's case against Blake Lively and a bunch of other defendants was dismissed. So there was a lot of back and forth in the news as to, this is a big win for her, and then he's spinning it differently. But what we talked about in the last episode is that, this doesn't mean that this isn't going to continue and potentially end up, not going in Blake Lively's favor in the long run, because he still obviously has the right to defend himself in her lawsuit. And that's where this issue has come up. The judge has granted a request to obtain Blake Lively's text messages with Taylor Swift that pertain to "It Ends With Us." So he's made it, as narrow as, you kind of can and what would be appropriate in a case like this to make sure it's relevant and not, just kind of a tactic to invade these people's privacy. I think Justin Baldoni and his attorney did drop a subpoena that was served on Taylor Swift herself to receive the documents from her, which is pretty common that you would get the documents from the other litigant in the case if they have them, as opposed to going after a non-party, especially in a case like this, where you can tell that the judge is skeptical with respect to Justin Baldoni and his attorney as to, are they kind of like showboating when they are trying to bring people like Taylor Swift into the case, but ultimately felt that Blake Lively herself may have opened the door to this because she apparently has put out there in the context of the litigation that at the time Taylor Swift was aware of the complaints that she was making about the workplace. So this is just another kind of, we say this all the time, and this is going to come up in any case where there's going to be things that come up that are relevant that you have to sort of make the decision going in, like, am I willing to take the risk that this is going to be allowed? In the age of text message and email and social media, all of that kind of thing is requested in a lawsuit. So if you've been communicating with somebody about something that's relevant into the lawsuit on text message, there's a risk that that might be discoverable. And the judge has found in this situation that if she was texting Taylor Swift about the movie, then that's relevant.
This is certainly a aggressive scorched earth tactic by Baldoni's lawyers. Splashy headlines probably creates a rift in the Swift um, lively relationship, I would imagine. I'm sure Taylor Swift has no interest in having her private text messages shared with the world. The one thing I will say is that I believe the judge issued a protective order around the text messages, so they can't be shared, at least in theory, by Baldoni or his people with like the media or anyone outside the litigation. And that's one thing that's typically used to try to protect private information from being shared. So that's, you know, some, uh, some, I guess, something of a win for them. But it's like you said, I mean, this goes back to what we talk about all the time, which is, once you file a lawsuit or you're involved in a lawsuit, everything's an open book. And we try to anticipate all these issues coming up in advance of filing a lawsuit, but to some degree, you can never anticipate anything. I don't know if her attorneys were aware that she had had text messages with Taylor Swift. We ask our clients about social media, about communications, but we don't ask them every single person they've ever texted with or messaged with or talked to about the situation, because you can't typically know all of that. So things pop up throughout the course of the case that you then have to, address. And it sounds like her folks addressed it as well as they could. But it just goes back to, if you're going to file a lawsuit, especially a public lawsuit, or I should say a publicly interesting lawsuit, you have to be well aware of the potential that anything and everything you've ever said relating to anything and everything relating to the claim could be brought out. And this is just another example of that.
Yeah, and everything in this case gets reported in sort of a very kind of sensational way. I mean, even the protective order, which is a very basic thing, I saw headlines being like, Blake Lively requests order of protection, which is like kind of insinuating that it's like something else, like an order of protection that you get against like a abuser or something like that. But a protective order is basically like a confidentiality agreement that the judge signs, so it's not anything interesting or exciting.
No.
But it's just like, and like you said, I mean, the whole internet is always like trying to figure out, like, is Taylor Swift, mad at her, and which of Taylor Swift's friends have unfollowed Blake Lively on social media and who hasn't. I mean, it's kind of silly in some ways, but it does, she may end up prevailing, but this definitely is an illustration of what can happen when you get involved in this type of situation, which I think is probably a good segue into our next topic, because I think this is a woman who also took a lot of that stuff into consideration before she sort of came forward. So this is the Alex Cooper.
Yeah. So Alex Cooper, the host of the Call Her Daddy podcast, who has had a very good couple of years and has gone from what I would consider to be popular but not wildly lucrative podcasts to becoming extremely lucrative, and now running basically what I understand to be like a media company, has come out publicly in conjunction with release of a documentary about her, and made allegations against her soccer coach at Boston University. She played soccer for 3 years at BU on a full scholarship, and came out with some pretty, I would say, serious allegations against the coach. Why don't you kind of explain it, and then we can talk about what type of harassment this actually is, and what some of the sort of responses have been.
Yeah, so I think probably most people know who Alex Cooper is, but she started the Call Her Daddy podcast. Was originally, she had a co-host, and then they started working for Barstool and it became super popular. And then she ended up doing it on her own with Barstool, after they kind of had a difference of opinion with her co-host in terms of, how they were going to continue and whatnot. She kind of played the long game so that she could hold on to her intellectual property. And when she left Barstool, she made the biggest deal with Spotify, I think, that any woman podcaster had ever made. And it kind of has taken off from there. And then recently she moved to Sirius with another like gigantic deal. And I think over the years, she has, and I don't know, obviously her audience is primarily women, so I don't know how much men have a sense of, her kind of cultural significance, but she has, I think, become a pretty well-respected interview, sort of like a modern day, like Barbara Walters. She's interviewed a lot of like, pretty important women like, Jane Fonda. She just interviewed Jane Goodall. She interviewed Kamala Harris during, I think that was the only podcast she went on, which some people think that might have been a mistake and she should have gone on the dude's podcast also. But, so she, I think, is pretty kind of well respected as an interviewer and in her media company sort of at this point, whether you like her or not. And one of the things I respect about her is that in a very kind of, divisive political climate, she has been willing to be vocal about like women's reproductive rights and things like that. So she hasn't, done what I think a lot of I think probably more so women do, which is sometimes err on the side of being kind of very diplomatic and not political. And she is like that typically, but she has come out on certain issues. So I do appreciate that about her. So anyway, long story short, she did a live tour a couple years ago, and was doing sort of a documentary that was intended to just document the behind the scenes of this tour. At somewhere along the line in the making of this documentary, she decided that she was going to be candid for the first time about why her soccer career ended. I feel like I've been talking for too long, so maybe do you want to ask a question? I'm now an expert on, I have her like BU's soccer stats pulled up
Yeah,
on my
yeah,
phone.
we
Like,
don't need to get into her soccer stats. So I think that the real issue is the soccer coach at BU was the one and only soccer coach there in like the first 27 years of the program. Apparently, like a very well-respected soccer coach who I just learned had a city street named after her in Boston after she retired.
yeah, and I
Um,
think there's like a day named after her in Boston.
yeah.
Now. A love
So
person.
yeah. So Alex Cooper comes out and says basically this coach created an environment that was focused on my physical looks, my body, asked me about sex, benched me when when she saw me leaving a man's car before practice, put her hand on my thigh and generally made me, extremely uncomfortable to the point where she stopped playing. She claims that she and her parents went to the school while she was still a player, and the school essentially said to her, "We're not doing anything. You can keep your scholarship," and left it there. Now, her roommate apparently supports this position, and we'll get in a minute to what the response has been. But from our perspective, I think her parent, part of the story is that they considered legal action at the time. And it's probably pretty common for people to think that, when you talk about sexual harassment, it's really in the context of one gender versus another. But as we've seen firsthand, that is not always the case. So, where would this fall, sort of legally, had she chosen to take any action? Which is obviously that ship has sailed. So now it's more of like she's trying to bring light to this situation rather than pursue any kind of legal action.
Yeah, so she went in with her parents. I mean, when you're in an educational context, it's a Title IX complaint. In an employment context, it's Title VII. Um, you know, sexual harassment is and sex discrimination is protected regardless of who is doing it. The wrinkle when it's a person of the same gender is it could be difficult to prove that the reason why you're being targeted is because of your sex. But in this situation, so I guess I'll just add to that a little bit, like in an employment context, and we get phone calls about this too. Sometimes you're in a work environment that the people are just like really gross and inappropriate, or there might be like one person there who's really gross and inappropriate, and they might be of the same gender as you. And they're showing you like pornography or talking to you like in a really gross way about, their own sex life or something like that. That's not necessarily protected unless that person has targeted you because of your gender. And most of the time, that's not the case. Most of the time, the person is just inappropriate, and that's not illegal. Like there's a ton of case law under Title VII that says, the courts are not here to police, appropriate behavior. It's not a standard of civility, et cetera, et cetera. So in the college context, it's going to be a Title IX complaint, and colleges do have specific procedures that they're supposed to follow if someone is coming to you and making that type of complaint. Now, you, of course, have to also make the decision, am I going to pursue that or not? And when they talked about this in the documentary, and her parents are both like very intelligent, very credible people. Her mother, I think, is like a PhD. Her father is a professional. They kind of were like a typical, like, nice family where you have your parents' support and you try to do the right thing. They went to lawyers first. And her parents went in there with her. Her mother is a therapist, so her mother literally wrote down every single thing contemporaneously when Alex Cooper would call her from school crying and telling her, like, this is what's going on. Apparently, they went to the administration or the athletic director with this book. And it sounds like that the way this meeting went down, the message was very clear that they were not going to take any action against the coach no matter what. And they really had no interest in investigating this. They wouldn't look at the book. And ultimately, she made the decision with her parents and to not pursue this any further at that time. And I think when we were talking about Blake Lively and, be careful what you wish for, be careful what you get into, the way she describes it is that the lawyers at the time, while, according to them, told her that she had a good legal case, at the same time cautioned her that she might be getting herself into something that was not going to be worth it in the long run, because they would heavily defend themselves, that if she was, very young at the time, to have that sort of burden on your shoulders, to have it carried with you for several years, which is certainly something that can happen in any lawsuit. And I think they ultimately, decided to give the school the opportunity to do the right thing. And according to them, they did not. So she has basically sat on this for many years. And then ultimately, according to her, some new information has come out recently where she has talked to some, former teammates that, have kind of validated what had happened to her and insinuated that issues like this may still be going on at the school, or had been still going on at the school until relatively recently. And that sort of empowered her to, decide that this was the right moment to, come out and explain. I think part of it is holding them accountable, and part of it is, if you listen to her podcast, which I do, not necessarily religiously, I think some of it is certainly directed towards, women that are younger than me. But, I do listen to it fairly often, and she speaks a lot about being a former athlete, and you can tell that, this was a huge part of her life, and she's involved in, women's professional soccer now through her brand. And I always did kind of wonder a little bit, like, is she embellishing this? Like, what kind of soccer player, like, was she really? I don't really understand, like, what her link to this it really is. And I think part of it is because she never really explained why she stopped playing soccer. And she does appear to have been kind of like a superstar. She went to BU on a full scholarship. It sounds like she was a pretty, integral member of the team. Like, I don't think she's trying to embellish what her role on the team was. I think there was like an idea that she would have been the captain at some point. But basically, according to her, and we see this in sexual harassment cases, like quid pro quo sexual harassment cases in the employment context, once she started sort of rejecting the advances or at least inappropriate conversation that this coach was doing, she stopped playing her. So, retaliatory, kind of things that we see in an employment context as well. So, I also listened to her. She was on the, so I watched the documentary, and then I listened to her on the Armchair Expert podcast, with Dax Shepard, where she actually went into like a lot more detail than is in the documentary. Because like I said, the documentary was really intended to be just kind of like a behind the scenes of her tour. And she went into a lot more detail on the Armchair Expert podcast. And I don't know, I mean, part of our job as employment lawyers and lawyers in general is like, you watch people and you kind of assess their credibility and you assess the circumstances in terms of, coming to a conclusion as to whether this person is credible or not. I mean, I thought she and her parents were very credible. And I did not perceive, I think this is like the next part of our conversation, anything untoward or strange about her coming out about this now and why now is what people always ask. But I thought she was very credible. I thought her parents were very credible. And then when you kind of watch the documentary in conjunction with this podcast she was on, where she went into a lot more detail about it, I thought that was, pretty compelling story as well.
So I have a few comments about. I mean, I think um, it's like you said. It's always a credibility assessment when somebody makes a sexual harassment allegation. So when we meet with clients about these cases, we're trying to determine if they're telling the truth. And one of the ways that you can help bolster a client's position and their appearance of being honest is when they have like contemporaneous notes, when they have other people supporting them, when they sort of made complaints close in time to when these things happened. That's not always the case. People are sometimes hesitant to come out. I think when you think about like her lawyers, and she went to the lawyers when she was still in college. I think they probably gave good advice because you know this is a very interesting, like, complete 180 in terms of like the power dynamic. And when, if you're a college student on a major university uh, athletic program, if you come out with something like this, you're basically going to be done. I mean, they have all the power, you know, at least particularly back then. I mean, I think college athletes have more power now than they used to. But they would have buried it, and they would have, they would have denied everything. They would have come out, like, in all likelihood, very publicly against her. And it would have followed, like you said, it would have followed her around for a long time. So it's very understandable why someone in that position would be hesitant. And I think it's good to see that lawyers kind of have that conversation, because I think a lot of times lawyers just see like the potential media and PR benefit and the big splashy headlines, and some lawyers will just go after that and maybe not give the client the best advice. And what you see here is that she then went on to build this major career and platform, had a complete shift in the power dynamic, and is now in the position where she's really the one controlling the narrative. And you haven't seen really anything from BU. You haven't heard one word from this coach who retired a couple of years ago, um, which we had a conversation about this last night. I think actually almost goes to the other extreme. Um, and that brings me to the kind of the next point, which is that after these allegations came out, um, in the last couple of days, I guess, a a group of former players for BU, 99 former players, signed off on a letter, uh, not disputing Alex Cooper's claims specifically, but um, supporting the coach and basically saying, this is not what we experienced when we played for her. So that's interesting for a few reasons. I know how you feel about it. But it shows kind of how the power dynamic has shifted, and then that now that these folks have come out to try to sort of buttress probably what they see as, there's a one-sided story because no one has really responded.
Yeah, so just, I mean, I guess I just want to preface this with just a couple things that I feel like for me were very compelling in terms of her story, which is that, like you said, when she was in college, the coach had all the power and the school had all the power because she's on a full scholarship. She came from, probably like an upper middle class family, but didn't, wasn't some rich person who was necessarily gonna pay her way at this school and be able to necessarily attend this school without a full scholarship. She also, sort of described and I think on the Armchair podcast, kind of like your dynamic with your coach is you do whatever the coach tells you to do. That's like the dynamic. And so a lot of what she also described, I think, are sort of hallmarks that we see not just in a sexual harassment situation, but maybe in more of like an domestic abuse kind of situation where, the coach started isolating her. The coach started calling her into one-on-one meetings. She started trying to drive her to her night classes. So some of this is I think background to show that there wouldn't have necessarily been that much of a reason for anyone else on her team to have known what was going on. And this is very common. Like, how many times do you hear about like a domestic abuse situation where you're like, I never would have known that, this husband or this boyfriend was treating this person like that. And it's because they isolate them. So, part of that is why I, as you know, was very fired up about this letter, because I I just I'm trying to like get my words out without being angry, because I really don't like that this letter came out, because what was the point? I know you said, or you will say like what you think the point of it is, but the letter itself says we're not trying to diminish anyone's individual experience, but here's our experience. That's fine if you want to say that, but you have to know that the effect of the letter is to undermine her. Whether that's your intention or not, but I honestly feel like the effect is so obvious that the intent has to be there. The coach has not even defended herself yet. BU put out the most wishy-washy statement I've ever read that had nothing to do with her actual allegations, and just said, we have a policy against sexual harassment. Yeah, that's because you're legally required to have that. So, sorry, a bug just flew in my face. So it's like this documentary came out maybe like a week ago or a couple weeks ago. The Armchair Expert podcast came out this week. So I also feel like it's irresponsible, because to me, to sign on this letter, I don't see how it's possible that the people who signed on to this letter had the time to truly listen to what she was saying. I don't think the timing worked out, and I could be wrong, but I don't think I am, that it would have worked out, that they would have listened to or that it even came out yet, this Armchair podcast where she went into like significantly more detail about what happened, including the people that she didn't name them, but giving the backstory of who has she spoken to more recently that sort of led her to come to this decision. So without doing your homework, within like a week of this coming out, you somehow wrangle, and like, who is responsible for doing this? I'd like to know also. You somehow wrangle almost 100 other women who are basically willing to like throw another woman under the bus, who, to me, if you listen to her, you would see that this was actually like a very difficult, like, she's crying while she's talking about it. Her parents are crying. Like, I thought it was horrifying, like, as another woman. Like, I was like, I cannot even imagine ever putting my name to something like this without at the very least giving it like a little more time to shake out. Like, I mean, every woman who walked past Harvey Weinstein on the street didn't get attacked. Like, every woman who dealt with Bill Cosby did not get, drugged. Like, the fact that you had a good experience with someone, to me, is like irrelevant in many ways as to whether they targeted another person in a way that nobody else really would have known. So like, you can say, I'm supporting the coach and I had a great relationship with this coach and I want to stand by her. Okay, fine. But like, this publicly, like, that if you go on a letter against a public figure with 100 other people, that's going to be represented in the news as like a complete challenge to what she's saying, regardless if your first sentence is, oh, I'm not trying to say it's not true what you're saying, but I don't know. I'm like, I did not think that was right.
I wonder if it would have been different if it wasn't someone in her position who made the allegations. I wonder if her platform and her popularity had something to do with the fact that they came out. I feel like if it were someone who was just an average person without a massive media platform who made this allegation, I bet, well, because I think it would be a lot less talked about. So I bet that there would have been more of a hesitation to come out. And I wonder how many of these people who signed off on the letter played on her team. I'd be curious about that too. The long and the short of it is, what?
Oh, sorry. No, I tried to find the letter. I couldn't find it. Like apparently it was like originally like TMZ Sports like got their hands on it, but then it got like just, reported by a bunch of other more like mainstream kind of news outlets. But I wasn't able to find that anyone actually like linked to this letter with these people's names on it. I would personally be horrified to have my name on a letter like this at this moment, in time of this person like just coming out with this.
Well, I think if there were a reason for them doing it, it would probably be, and I'm not saying I agree with it necessarily, but I think it would probably be that they feel that it's been a, and this goes back to the power dynamic, which is this has been basically a trial and an execution in the public of this coach who hasn't responded because, and Alex Cooper has a massive platform, and her side of the story, her narrative is the only one that's been out there. And look, I agree with you. I mean, I haven't listened to nearly as much as you have, so I don't have any, judgment on it. I have no reason to think she's not telling the truth. And I think going back to my comments and your comments earlier, it would seem like she's got a pretty good credibility story on her side. Um, maybe it's that these players have a close relationship with the coach and feel that this has been a completely one-sided story, and they're just trying to support the coach. I'm not saying I think it was like the smartest thing, because the problem with coming out with something like this is that you don't actually know what happened. And so if it turns out that you're wrong, then you really look pretty bad. I mean, it's like, I don't know if this happened, but I think back to like Jerry Sandusky at Penn State, which is a much worse situation. Um, but when the initial allegations came out, I can imagine if like a group of former players came out and were like, "Oh, we always had a good experience with Coach Sandusky," and it turns out the guy was like doing really horrible things, you'd obviously feel pretty stupid if you had put your name on that letter. So I think to your point, I'd probably be a little bit hesitant to sign off on something like that, especially so quickly. But I don't want to belabor this one too much. Couldn't the coach sue her for defamation if this was in fact not true? I'm not saying she would, but
And I
that's
think she addresses that. I mean, part of it, and I think this lends itself to her sort of credibility, which is, first of all, she has absolutely nothing to gain by doing this. Like she just got, a gigantic, like over $160 million like deal with Sirius like months ago, or even longer. She's at like appears to be like a great, place in her life with like her brand. She's like partners with her husband. Like she was talking about what it's like to work with your husband, which is like not necessarily relevant to the podcast, but she was kind of saying a lot of stuff that I feel like you and I say when people ask us about working together. I see no reason why at this moment in time she would make a false accusation against this coach. And it just like it doesn't make any sense. And I mean, she basically says that one of the reasons why she kept quiet for so long is because she didn't have any power or resources or anything like that to fight back against retaliation, like a retaliatory lawsuit. This is what, Blake Lively is also, in a position or in a situation where she is kind of saying the same thing. Like I now am sort of a double victim. Like I'm a victim of what I'm saying happened to me in my relationship with, Baldoni in terms of the employment relationship. And now I'm the victim of a retaliatory lawsuit. Um, and she's basically saying like, I kind of had to get to the point where not only had I sort of made peace with this enough to speak about it publicly, but I also now have the resources. And she obviously made a very calculated decision that I'm going to come out and say this person's name, first and last name. I'm not going to be, let people read between the lines. I'm not going to make like insinuations, which sometimes people do. I mean, there's plenty of celebrities who will insinuate like, oh, I had a bad experience on this movie set, or I had a bad experience with this like lecherous, director or whatever, but they never, and they let kind of like people read between the lines. She's making a very, informed, calculated decision to um bring this up and take the risk that she would be sued for defamation. And just the last thing on, this letter, like when I'm listening to the Armchair podcast, like Dax Shepard is basically like, I don't, she expresses this about the retaliation and this and that, and how she's going to be received, and if she's going to get a backlash. And he kind of, maybe naively in some ways, because he's a guy, is sort of like, I don't see how anybody could like be negative towards you about this. And his co-host was kind of like, I don't know about that. And at that time when they're filming this, this letter had not come out.
Yeah.
So I have like some compassion for her, because I can imagine that, you come out, you're probably prepared for, negative Instagram comments about you, negative social media kind of stuff. You're probably prepared to be sued for defamation by BU and the woman. Are you like mentally prepared that 100 freaking people are going to come out of the woodwork and write a letter against you within a week? I don't know if you're mentally prepared for that. I probably would have gone under the covers in the fetal position if somebody did that to me. Like, I really
Ah,
have a big problem with that.
I feel like she was probably prepared for everything. The last point on this that I'll make is that, you know, this definitely happens all the time, that people are afraid to take action because of the consequences. We have conversations like this all the time with potential clients where they were something definitely wrong happened that was wrong. And we explained to them it's basically a cost benefit analysis of taking action, legal action. And in a lot of cases, people choose not to because of the fallout that will inevitably come from pursuing a claim against a more powerful person or entity. So I have no doubt that that was a consideration. And, I don't dismiss that at all because we do see it firsthand. All right, we'll leave it there. If anything comes of that, we'll talk about it at another episode. One last creepy, weird case before we break. Um, reported in the news, a a former employee of Truist Bank, which is North Carolina based, is suing the company because her boss left a Chucky doll on her chair following a training session. And your first reaction is probably, how is that illegal? But we're here to tell you why that's potentially illegal. So why don't you explain why, for this particular person, in this particular circumstance, leaving a Chucky doll in their chair was maybe illegal.
So in this situation, it's actually like a disability discrimination case. And this employee apparently had disclosed to their boss at somewhere along the way during their employment that they, have a couple different mental health issues that they're dealing with and whatnot. Um, Part of this potentially being, not potentially, part of that being a fear of dolls. So I guess there is a little bit more backstory to this, and the Chucky doll was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, where they received, some ridicule, and some harassment, and then ultimately culminating in this Chucky doll being on their chair, which has led to like a PTSD diagnosis and things like that. So it was one of those things where, like, we kind of have had this little misleading headline of the week. So of course the headline is like another one of these headlines that's designed for everyone to be like, oh, lawyers, plaintiffs, these people are like totally unreasonable, and can you imagine even filing a lawsuit about this? So ridiculous. But then when you read the article, which you could tell was probably pulled from the complaint in this case, it sort of paints like much more of a picture of, how could something like that end up being, the straw that breaks the camel's back, and like a real, in a situation that, when you look at all the circumstances, might actually be like a harassment, or disability discrimination kind of situation. But I did sort of chuckle, no pun intended, when I saw that headline.
Yeah, look, it's like I read the article, I read the headline. I mean, there seems to have been a long running long running claims of harassment, and some of them may be legitimate, some of them maybe not. Um, but it seems like it's pretty stupid of the boss, knowing that this person had these sort of challenges, to leave leave the doll in the chair. I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
Truist
it's like,
Truist is going to have to defend this case, and they're probably going to settle it because it's making national headlines. No one's going to report on this after the fact. No one's going to know what happens here. This is not a case that the media is going to follow forever, but it made a headline, and now they're going to
in
have to
People magazine.
pay
I mean,
money.
that's pretty like, pretty
Yeah,
huge platform to have, a headline. But yeah, and I mean, it's stupid, and I think it's like we've been doing this for a pretty long time, and I still will talk to people, and every once in a while, like, will be speechless as to something that they have experienced in the workplace. Like, there is no end to like people doing extremely foolish things.
yeah. I'm just looking at the comments on the People Magazine website. Uh, yeah, I wouldn't say they're particularly favorable to her,
No, I
but
mean, people, there's always like this idea that there's all these frivolous lawsuits out there in the world, and I feel like the news likes to pick up on them. But it, as with all, I think, legal reporting, which was probably our original reason for starting a little podcast, was to kind of explain like a little bit deeper than the headline, because a lot of this stuff isn't reported very accurately. And that's a case where when you really read the article as an employment lawyer, you're like, okay, I can see how the surrounding circumstances of this situation could lend themselves to this just being one piece of a bigger picture, of discrimination.
100%. And the problem is that whenever I have to pick a jury for a trial, one of the first things I ask them is how they feel about lawsuits, and inevitably someone says something about like a case like this, or the hot coffee one is a big one. But and you have to try to break through and explain to them like, all right, there are some silly lawsuits, but there's always more to the story. And if I told you this, would you agree that it maybe this wasn't silly and this person was actually like severely hurt by it? And so these headlines don't help us. They don't help us fight the good fight. But it is what it is. All right. Anything else?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. We will be back again soon talking about all the headlines, misleading headlines, cases in the news, legal stories. And if you have any questions, like I said, feel free to hit us up on the socials. Again, thanks for listening. Please subscribe, like, and share. And we'll be back again soon. Thanks.